By the time her father realized she was no longer under his control, the house was already slipping away from him. Not in a dramatic collapse. Not with raised voices or slammed doors. It was quieter than that. Papers filed. Accounts adjusted. Decisions made without his permission. The kind of change that only becomes visible once it's irreversible. He would later replay the moment in his head, trying to identify when he lost authority. He would fail, because the truth was uncomfortable. He never noticed the moment she stopped asking. Elena had always been the dependable one. That was the word everyone used. Dependable meant she showed up early, stayed late, and didn't complain. Dependable meant she absorbed inconvenience so others didn't have to. Her father, Robert, said it with pride, the way a man praises something that functions exactly as expected. He never said it with gratitude. Gratitude implies choice. Dependability, to him, was simply her role. Her younger brother, Mark, filled the space Elena never occupied. He was loud where she was quiet, ambitious where she was practical. When Mark spoke, people leaned in. When Elena spoke, people nodded and moved on. The family adjusted around Mark's needs automatically. Elena learned early that the fastest way to peace was silence. Resistance created tension. Silence kept things moving. That silence became her currency. At family dinners, Robert talked about discipline and loyalty. He spoke about legacy as if it were something he personally carried in his bloodstream. Elena listened, passed dishes, and cleared plates. When decisions were made, they were announced, not discussed. If Mark needed support, the family invested. If Elena needed time, she was reminded of responsibility. She paid her share without being asked. She took on extra hours without acknowledgement. She handled logistics because she was good at it. Over time, those tasks grew heavier. Bills. Documents. Emails. Things Robert didn't want to deal with anymore. He trusted Elena with them because she never pushed back. What he never asked himself was why. The shift didn't happen in a single moment. There was no dramatic rebellion, no emotional outburst. Instead, there was a slow change in how Elena listened. She stopped reacting emotionally. She started paying attention structurally. Dates. Signatures. Language buried in contracts. She didn't question instructions. She followed them precisely. But she remembered everything. Robert mistook her calm for agreement. It made him careless. Mark failed his first serious attempt at independence before he turned 30. A business idea that sounded impressive but collapsed under poor planning. Robert reacted the way he always did, by trying to fix it with money and pressure. He talked about second chances and family obligation. He talked about belief. And then he asked Elena to help. Not directly. He never did. He framed it as temporary. A formality. Just until things stabilized. Elena listened. She asked a few neutral questions. She didn't argue. She didn't refuse. She asked for time. That pause unsettled Robert more than he expected. He didn't say it, but he felt it. Something had shifted, though he couldn't yet name it. He reassured himself quickly. Elena had always complied. Silence had always meant yes. What he didn't realize was that silence no longer meant anything at all. And that was the mistake that would cost him everything. Elena never followed up on the request. She didn't mention the paperwork again, didn't remind her father that he was waiting for an answer. Instead, she went on with her routines exactly as before. She showed up on time. She handled emails. She balanced numbers. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was the part Robert found comforting. Stability looked like obedience. Inside, however, Elena had already shifted her posture. She stopped viewing family requests as emotional obligations and started treating them like transactions that needed clarity. When Robert handed her documents to review, she read them line by line. When he asked her to file something, she kept copies. When money moved, she tracked where it came from and where it landed. Not out of suspicion. Out of accuracy. That was how she justified it to herself. Mark, meanwhile, moved through the house like failure wasn't his fault. He talked about timing, about unfair markets, about people who didn't understand his vision. Robert listened patiently. Elena listened quietly. She noticed how responsibility always curved away from Mark and landed somewhere else. Usually on her. Over time, Robert began relying on Elena more heavily. He forwarded her emails without reading them. Asked her to handle it without explanation. He liked telling people his daughter was sharp, organized, and trustworthy. He never noticed how that trust gave her access he no longer monitored. She learned the structure of his finances better than he knew them himself. Which accounts were personal. Which were tied to the house. Which were leveraged against future plans. She learned how often he moved money to cover gaps Mark left behind. None of it was illegal. But all of it depended on control. And control depends on awareness. The refinancing happened during a period when Robert was distracted. Mark was pitching another idea. Bigger this time. More expensive. Robert saw it as redemption. Elena saw it as repetition. She processed the paperwork because that was what she always did. Robert skimmed and signed. He trusted her to catch errors. She did. Just not the ones he thought mattered. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No argument. No raised voice. Elena filed the documents correctly. Exactly as instructed. The shift was subtle, buried in language no one but a careful reader would notice. At the time, it meant nothing to Robert. He left the room confident, certain the house was still his anchor. Elena closed her laptop and sat still for a long moment. She understood something then, with a clarity that surprised her. She didn't need to fight. She didn't need to confront anyone. The system her father built to control everyone else was fragile. It only worked as long as she kept holding it together. And she was very tired of holding things together. The change after that was gradual. Elena stopped volunteering for extra responsibilities. She declined politely. She took longer to respond to requests that once received immediate attention. Not enough to cause alarm. Just enough to create friction. Robert noticed delays but attributed them to stress. Mark barely noticed anything at all. When Elena moved out, there was no announcement. She found a small place, signed the lease, and informed her parents once it was done. Robert didn't object. He said it was healthy. Independent. He assumed distance would change nothing. He was wrong. Without Elena absorbing pressure, small cracks widened. Deadlines slipped. Payments overlapped. Mark's second attempt stalled before launch. Robert felt the strain but couldn't identify the source. He assumed the problem was external. It always had been. It wasn't. The first time Robert sensed real unease was when he asked Elena to co-sign again and she said no. Calmly. Without explanation. Without anger. She didn't justify herself. She didn't argue. She simply said it wasn't something she could do. For the first time in years, Robert had no leverage. And he didn't yet understand why. Robert didn't react immediately to her refusal. That was his instinct when authority failed him. He paused, recalibrated, convinced himself this was temporary confusion rather than defiance. Elena had always returned to alignment. He told himself she would again. Still, something unsettled him. The refusal had been too clean. No apology. No justification. Just a boundary, placed quietly and left standing. He tried a different approach. He softened his tone. He spoke about family history, about sacrifices he had made, about how Mark only needed one solid break. Elena listened, nodded once or twice, and didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reassure him. When the conversation ended, nothing had changed. Robert walked away frustrated but uncertain where to apply pressure. The familiar levers no longer worked. Mark, sensing the shift, grew restless. He complained more openly, resented Elena's distance, accused her of forgetting where she came from. She didn't engage. The more emotional he became, the quieter she grew. That contrast unnerved him. He was used to resistance he could push against, not silence that absorbed impact and gave nothing back. Robert began tightening control in other areas. He scrutinized expenses. He questioned decisions Elena no longer made. He tried to reassert dominance through routine authority. But the house felt different. Smaller. Less responsive. Things that once resolved themselves now required effort. He realized, uncomfortably, how much labor had been invisible to him for years. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Robert, formal, precise. He opened it at the kitchen table, assuming it was another notice or statement. Halfway through the first page, his posture changed. He reread the paragraph, then the one after it. By the time he reached the end, his hands were no longer steady. The house was no longer protected the way he believed it was. He read the language again, searching for misinterpretation. There was none. Ownership had shifted years ago during a restructuring he barely remembered authorizing. At the time, it had seemed administrative. He had signed where Elena pointed. Trusted her to handle details. She had. Just not in the way he assumed. Robert confronted her that evening. Not with anger. With disbelief. He demanded explanations, and accused her of withholding information. Elena listened without interruption. When he finished, she spoke carefully. She reminded him that every document had been processed under his instruction. That he had signed willingly. That nothing had been hidden. What changed, she said calmly, is that I stopped compensating for what you didn't read. The words landed harder than any insult. Robert felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Vulnerability. He pushed it away immediately, replacing it with outrage. He accused her of betrayal. Of manipulation. Of disloyalty. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood up and said the conversation was over. That night, Robert sat alone at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed. He stared at documents he no longer fully understood. For the first time, authority felt theoretical. He had spent decades believing control was permanent. He was learning it was conditional. He tried one final tactic. He told Elena that distance had consequences. That family support could be withdrawn. That loyalty was remembered. He expected fear. He expected negotiation. What he received instead was indifference. Elena told him she understood. She told him she wished him well. Then she left. The house felt hollow after that. Mark moved out shortly afterward, chasing another opportunity that never materialized. Robert was left with space and silence and the slow realization that power, once lost, does not announce its departure. It simply stops responding. Weeks passed. Then months. The official notices followed. Legal language. Financial reviews. Things Robert had avoided thinking about but could no longer ignore. He tried to call Elena. She didn't answer. He sent messages that remained unread. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to speak into a void. He had raised a daughter who learned everything he taught her. Including how to walk away. And that realization arrived too late. The legal consequences unfolded without drama, which was perhaps the most unsettling part for Robert. There were no confrontations, no final arguments that could be reframed later as misunderstandings. Everything arrived in writing. Clear. Precise. Unemotional. Notices explaining adjustments. Letters outlining responsibilities he no longer held. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, not because of what it said, but because of what it confirmed. He tried to frame the situation as temporary. A phase. A misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right conversation. But conversations require access, and Elena had removed herself from reach without hostility. She hadn't blocked him. She simply didn't respond. That absence was more effective than anger ever could have been. Mark called once, his voice tight with frustration. He blamed Elena openly, accused her of abandoning the family when things were difficult. Robert listened, but even as his son spoke, the truth surfaced in fragments he couldn't ignore. Mark had never built anything that lasted. He had always assumed someone else would stabilize the outcome. For years, that someone had been Elena. Now there was no one. Months later, Robert saw her by chance at a coffee shop across town. She looked different, though he couldn't immediately identify why. Not happier. Not triumphant. Just settled. As if she no longer carried weight that didn't belong to her. He considered approaching her. Rehearsed a dozen openings in his head. None of them felt legitimate. She noticed him eventually. Their eyes met. She nodded once. Polite. Neutral. Then she returned to her work and didn't look up again. That was when Robert understood the full cost of his mistake. He had believed authority was enforced through pressure. Through expectation. Through silence that bent others into alignment. He had never considered that silence could also be preparation. That patience could be a form of power. That obedience, when withdrawn, leaves nothing behind to negotiate with. Elena never told anyone what she had done. She didn't correct the story when others framed it as distance or ambition or coldness. She allowed people to misunderstand her. That, too, was a form of peace. She focused on her work, on building a life that didn't require justification. The systems she put in place held without constant attention. For the first time, her energy went toward growth instead of maintenance. Robert adjusted, slowly. Downsized. Relearned limitations he had never expected to face. Some nights, he replayed old conversations, searching for the moment he could have chosen differently. He always arrived at the same conclusion. He hadn't lost control because Elena took it from him. He lost it because he assumed it would always be there. She never needed revenge. She needed separation. And once she stopped protecting the structure that depended on her silence, it collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. Revenge didn't change her past. But it finally gave her future back. Some lessons don't come with warnings. If this story felt real to you, you already understand why.